911 emergency, what are you reporting?
I just ran away from home. I live in a family of 15, and my two little sisters right now, they're chained up.
Okay, how old are you?
I'm 17.
Copy.
The silence of the early morning in Riverside County was broken by a sound no emergency operator ever expects to hear. When the phone rang, the voice on the other end was high and thin, sounding much younger than its 17 years. It was Julian Vance, a boy who had just stepped out of a nightmare and into the cold California air. 911 emergency, what are you reporting? The operator asked, her voice steady and professional. Julian took a breath, his chest tight with a fear he had carried his whole life. I just went away from home, he whispered, the words tumbling out as he looked back at the house that held his entire world captive. Then came the detail that turned a simple runaway report into a race against time. My two little sisters right now are chained up. The operator paused, the weight of the claim sinking in as she asked for his age. Julian's answer, I'm 17, only added to the mystery, for he spoke with the hesitation of someone who had never truly been allowed to grow up. In that moment, the digital recording captured more than just a call. It captured the first crack in a wall of secrets that had hidden 13 children from the world for decades. Julian stood at the edge of his bedroom window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. For 17 years, this house had been his entire universe, a place of dim hallways and the heavy scent of neglect. He had spent 2 years gathering the courage for this single moment, waiting for the perfect second when his mother's laughter from the kitchen meant she was distracted by the older children. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he pushed the screen aside and dropped onto the dry grass below. The world outside felt impossibly large and frighteningly quiet. As he ran down the driveway, his legs felt heavy and strange, unaccustomed to moving with such speed. He didn't look back at the suburban facade that hid the chains and the hunger. He only looked toward the sidewalk. Every shadow looked like his father, and every rustle of the wind sounded like his mother's voice calling him back to the dark. When his feet finally hit the pavement, he began to run with everything he had, disappearing from the view of the house's security cameras and taking his very first steps into a reality he had only ever dreamed of. Julian reached the corner of the block and collapsed against the cold metal pole of a stop sign. The neighborhood was silent, but his mind was screaming. He fumbled with the old cell phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and finally managed to dial those 3 life-changing numbers. When the operator asked for his name, his jaw locked. He tried to speak, but only a sharp, ragged breath came out. Jordan? No, Julian, he stammered, his teeth clicking together as he shivered in the night air. The dispatcher asked him to spell his last name, but his brain felt like it was moving through thick mud. He had never been to school, never sat in a classroom, and the letters he had practiced in secret seemed to vanish. He spelled it once, then again, getting it wrong both times as his vision blurred with tears. He gave a string of house numbers instead of a street name because he had never been allowed to walk far enough to see the signs. Standing under that red sign, Julian realized just how small his world had been, and how much he would have to learn if he was ever going to be truly free. Standing under the lonely glow of the street lamp, Julian took another deep, shaky breath. Do you need my address? He asked, his voice cracking as he looked toward the dark horizon where his home sat. He knew that giving this information was the only way to save his siblings, but his mind was spinning with numbers he didn't quite understand. Okay, you got to give me a minute, he whispered to the operator. This is going to take a bit. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the front of the house he had lived in for years but rarely ever touched. 9257 case, he finally managed to say. The operator asked him to spell it, and he struggled through the 4 simple letters, say S-E. But when she asked for more, he became confused, rattling off a long string of numbers. 92570, 5, 5, 7, without any street names to go with them. He didn't know that he was giving the zip code and parts of a phone number because he had never been taught how a real address worked. I'm sorry, he whispered, feeling a wave of shame. I don't go out much, so I don't know anything about the streets. Despite his confusion, those few numbers were enough. The dispatcher realized this wasn't just a lost boy. It was a 9,257 case. The code for a welfare check that would soon pull the mask off the Vance family's perfect life. Julian stood still, panting in the darkness, terrified that his parents might emerge from the shadows at any moment to take him back to the silence. The headlights of a patrol car finally cut through the darkness, and Deputy Anthony Kachi pulled up to the curb. He had been working a long night shift and expected to find a typical runaway, but the figure standing under the stop sign stopped him cold. Julian was small, thin, and looked like a young child, yet he claimed to be nearly an adult. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was messy, but it was the look in his eyes, a mix of total terror and desperate hope, that the deputy would never forget.
Julian.
What's going on? The deputy asked gently. Julian's voice was barely a whisper as the words poured out of him. He explained that he lived in a family of 15 and had just escaped through a window because his sisters were chained to their beds. As Kachi listened, he realized that the person in front of him wasn't just small because of his age. He was small because he had been starved of food and sunlight for most of his life. Julian stood there, shaking in the cold morning air, looking more like a frightened 10-year-old than a young man of 17. He had spent his whole life hiding from the world, and now he was putting his entire future into the hands of a stranger in a uniform. Inside the patrol car, Julian sat stiffly, his eyes darting around at the glowing buttons and screens he had never seen before. Deputy Kachi asked a simple question to check on the family's health. Does anybody at the house take any kind of medication? Julian looked at him with a blank, confused expression. Oh, I don't know what medication is, he whispered. The deputy tried again, asking if they took any medicines or pills, and Julian struggled to understand. He mentioned that when they had colds, they sometimes took rotation, but he wasn't even sure what that meant. This small moment revealed a heartbreaking truth. Julian and his siblings were so cut off from the world that they didn't even have the words for basic health care. Julian admitted he had never finished first grade and had never been to a real school. He didn't even know that his parents' rules, like not being allowed to use the backyard or take a bath more than once a year, were actually against the law. As they drove toward the house, it became clear that Julian wasn't just escaping a building. He was escaping a lifetime of being kept in total darkness about how the rest of the world lived. As they neared the driveway, Julian pulled the old cell phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. This device was his only shield, a small piece of plastic and glass that held the proof no one would believe otherwise. With trembling fingers, he opened the gallery to show Deputy Kachi the images he had risked everything to capture. The screen flickered to life, revealing blurry but undeniable photos of his younger sisters. They weren't just sitting on their beds. Heavy, rusted metal chains were wrapped around their small waists and padlocked to the bed frames. The deputy stared at the images of the girls, who looked frail and covered in dirt, their skin bruised by the weight of the iron. Julian explained that his sister had told him he needed to get these pictures because, in the dark world of the Vance house, the truth was often treated like a lie. These digital files were the first real evidence that the perfect family at 9257 case was a mask for something much darker. Looking at the photos, the deputy knew there was no turning back. Julian had given him the key to unlock the House of Horrors. As the patrol car moved toward the house, Julian began to tell the deputy about their life before California. He spoke about a time years ago when the family lived in Texas, a period that felt like a long, dark shadow in his memory. He explained that his parents had done things differently there, but just as cruelly. They had once moved into an apartment and left all the children alone in a trailer for 3 or 4 years, only returning once a week to drop off a small amount of food. Julian didn't know the full details, but the neighbors in Texas would never forget what the Vances left behind. When the family fled in the middle of the night, people went inside to find a scene of total horror. The refrigerator and doors were covered in heavy padlocks, and frayed ropes were still tied to the bare metal bunk beds where children had once been held. The house was so filled with trash and waste that the abandoned dogs were found trying to survive on used diapers. For the Vances, moving to a new state wasn't a fresh start. It was just a way to keep their secrets hidden in a bigger house with thicker walls. As Julian sat in the back of the police car, He looked toward the house with a look of pure dread. He explained to the deputy that escaping was even more terrifying because the house was protected by a high-tech security system. He described a constant, sharp beeping sound that echoed through the hallways. To Julian and his siblings, that sound was a warning. A signal that their parents were always watching and that an alarm would go off if anyone tried to leave their designated spots. The truth was much sadder. The security system Julian feared was actually just the low battery chirp of the home's smoke detectors. Sterling and Eleanor had never bothered to change the batteries, and they let the noise continue for years to keep the children in a state of constant fear. They had turned a simple household safety device into a tool for psychological torture, making the children believe the very walls were spying on them. This beeping was a constant reminder that they were never truly alone, and it was one of the biggest reasons it had taken Julian so long to find the courage to climb out that window. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet neighborhood, casting long, cool shadows across the pavement. At the Vance home, the world was still silent, the family inside unaware that their long reign of control was about to end. At exactly 7 a.m., the peaceful morning was shattered by a loud, firm knock on the front door. Sterling and Eleanor Vance had spent years making sure no one ever looked too closely at their lives. When they finally opened the door, they were met by a group of police officers who looked serious and determined. The officers explained they were there for a welfare check to make sure everyone in the house was safe and okay. Sterling stood in the doorway, his face pale and surprised. He tried to act like a normal father who had just been woken up, telling the officers that the family was just in bed and that the house was a mess because they were packing and getting ready to move. He never expected that Julian was sitting in a patrol car just around the corner, or that the police already knew the dark secrets hidden behind that door. The knock wasn't just a request to come in. It was the sound of the outside world finally breaking through the walls they had built to keep their children in the dark. Sterling and Eleanor Vance stood in the entryway, trying their best to look like any other tired parents on a Sunday morning. Sterling, an engineer who was used to being in charge, kept his voice calm and steady as he spoke to the officers. "We were just in bed," he said with a small shrug, acting as if the loud knocking was just a minor annoyance. Eleanor stood beside him, her face a mask of fake confusion, nodding along as her husband claimed they were busy packing for a big move to Oklahoma. They played their normal card perfectly, talking about job transfers and the stress of moving 13 children. Sterling even mentioned that he had a gun locked away safely, hoping that being honest about something small would make the police trust him. They were polite and professional, betting everything on the idea that the police wouldn't want to bother a respectable family over a messy house. But even as they spoke, their eyes kept darting toward the back hallway, terrified that the officers would stop listening to their excuses and start looking at what was hidden in the dark. The officers stood on the porch, listening to Sterling's calm voice, but they were watching his hands. Behind him, the house was dark and smelled like old, rotting food. Even though Sterling kept saying everything was fine, the police knew they couldn't just walk away. They had a report of children in chains, and every second they stayed on the porch was a second those children remained in danger. Under the law, police usually need a special paper called a warrant to enter a home. However, there is a rule called exigent circumstances. This means if a police officer reasonably believes that someone inside a house is being hurt or is in immediate danger, they have the right to enter right away to save them. Looking at Sterling's nervous eyes and hearing the strange silence from inside the large house, the officers decided they had seen enough. "Sir, we're going to come in and check," one officer said firmly. Sterling tried to ask if they had a search warrant, but the officers didn't wait. They pushed past the heavy wooden door jamb where Sterling was standing. As they stepped into the entryway, the professional mask the Vances had worn for years finally began to slip. The air inside was thick and humid, carrying a powerful stench of waste that made the officers want to cough. They were no longer just visiting a neighbor. They were stepping into a crime scene. As the officers moved deeper into the house, the true horror of the Vance home began to reveal itself. Every inch of the floor was hidden under thick mounds of rotting food, moldy trash, and old waste. The air was heavy and damp, making it hard for the officers to breathe as the powerful stench of human waste filled their lungs. It was clear that no one had cleaned this house in many years. Among the piles of garbage, the officers noticed something very strange. They saw dozens of unopened boxes and packages. Inside were brand new children's toys and bright, clean clothes that still had the store tags on them. While the children lived in filth and wore rags, these beautiful items sat untouched in the middle of the mess. Sterling and Eleanor had used these toys to torment the children, showing them what they could have but never allowing them to touch or play with them. The house wasn't just a place of neglect. It was a place where the parents purposefully kept joy just out of reach. The officers moved toward the back of the house, their flashlights cutting through the thick, dark air. In the first 2 bedrooms, they found small children sitting quietly on filthy mattresses, their eyes wide with fear. The rooms were crowded with metal bunk beds, and the floor was covered in the same rotting trash that filled the rest of the home. While one officer spoke gently to the girls, another noticed a third door that had been partially hidden by the parents. As the officer stepped into the 3rd bedroom, his light landed on a sight that made him stop in his tracks. There, on a top bunk bed, sat a young boy. Unlike the others, he wasn't just sitting. He was held down by heavy metal chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles. The chains were locked tight to the bed frame, leaving him unable to move more than a few inches. The boy looked up at the officers, his face pale and his body thin from years of hunger. In the girls' room, another officer slid open a closet door and found even more chains hidden inside. The perfect family facade was gone forever, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the iron locks used to break the spirits of children. Outside the house, the cool morning air did nothing to calm the rising tension. Sterling and Eleanor were led out to the driveway, where the bright sun made them squint. For years, they had been the masters of their own world, but now the clicking sound of metal handcuffs was the only thing they could hear. Sterling looked down at his hands, his face pale and frozen. He didn't seem to understand how his carefully built walls had crumbled so quickly. Eleanor appeared confused as she was led toward a patrol car. She asked the officers what was happening, claiming she had never been in trouble before. Even when the police asked for the keys to the heavy padlocks found on the beds, the parents tried to act like it was a normal way to live. But as they saw more officers entering the house with bolt cutters, the truth finally sank in. They weren't in charge anymore. Their secret life was being broadcast to the whole neighborhood, and for the first time, they were the ones who were trapped while their children were finally being set free. As the investigation continued, the police learned more about how Sterling and Eleanor justified their cruelty. The parents were deeply religious, but they used their faith as a weapon to control their children. They often pointed to verses in the book of Deuteronomy to tell the children that they had a right to treat them this way. They taught the children that being chained up or starved was a form of holy discipline. One of the older daughters, Jennifer, explained that the parents used these religious teachings to keep them in a state of constant fear. They were told that if they did one little thing wrong, they were disobeying not just their parents but a higher power. This twisted version of religion was the beeping noise in their minds, a psychological wall that made them feel like they could never leave. Even when the children were starving, the parents would leave out large pies or new toys just to watch the children struggle with the temptation to sin by touching them. By using faith as an excuse for abuse, Sterling and Eleanor had ensured that their children were prisoners in their own hearts long before they were ever put in iron chains. The rescue at the Vance home was only the start of a long journey for the 13 siblings. After years of living in the dark, they were finally brought into the light. The younger children were placed in foster homes, and the adults were given special care to help them learn how to live in a world they had never known. Sterling and Eleanor were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring they would never be able to use chains or hunger to control their children again. Even though the recovery was hard, the Vance children proved to be incredibly strong. Julian's older sister, Jennifer, became a voice of hope for the group. She started going to college and learned how to live on her own, something she once thought was impossible. She told others that while her past was full of pain, it made her a fighter. "I'm strong," she said, "and I'm shooting through life like a rocket." The siblings also had to fight for the help they were promised. When money donated by kind strangers was kept from them by a guardian, they didn't give up. They spoke out until the truth was heard, and they finally received the support they needed to build their new lives. Today, Julian and his brothers and sisters are no longer defined by the house of horrors or the evil rules of their parents. They are defined by their courage, their love for each other, and their bright futures as they continue to move forward faster and further than anyone ever expected.